Good morning, everyone. Just gonna take my customary minute and let everybody get connected. That includes myself. Don't need to be on Facebook right now. Hope quarantine's treating everybody well. Oh. Alexa, turn on living room lights. As per usual, just letting people come in the room. Hi, how's everyone doing? I am talking to myself. Okay. Oh, yay, I'm not talking to myself anymore. Hello. Welcome in. Good morning. We're got 2 viewers. Yay. Yes, good morning, Kimberly. So looks like people are filtering on in. Let's go ahead and get started with our continuing our discussion of the institution of the U.S. Congress. We left off actually on the previous slide. Hold on a second. We left off talking about how members of Congress get to Congress. We talked about the importance of perpetual campaigning in our institutions. Good morning. And the the permanent campaign, right? Every 2 years, whole House of Representatives is up again. So if you're a House member, you're always campaigning, and that means spending a lot of time back in your district. But that also means spending not a lot of time in Washington, D.C., so not getting very chummy with your fellow legislators, and that can lead to further partisan polarization. That's where we left off our last lecture. I'm going to start this lecture talking about Washington, D.C. And I realized that I actually really want my web browser open for this because I like to use Google Maps for this part of the lecture. You're going to see me do this with the White House too. It's a thing, right? So the United States Capitol is right here. You can actually see it is actually the center of the Washington, D.C. street plan. It is set off in this gigantic, kind of parkish area here. And these are the office buildings of the members of Congress. There's 3 for the House, the Rayburn, Longworth, and Cannon office buildings, and there's 2 for the Senate, the Hart and Russell buildings here. So the United States Capitol, big and imposing though it may be. I mean, this is not a small building, even today. But this building, big and imposing though it may be, does not actually house the offices of the majority of Congress. We'll talk about who's in there and who's in it, who isn't, and why it matters. Hey, Tippy, leave her alone. Guys, I'm trying to work. So Capitol Building is sitting on a hill, so we call it Capitol Hill, right? And the dome of the Capitol there is taller than every building in Washington, D.C. except one. That's actually by law. There's a city code that says no building can be taller than the Capitol dome than the Washington Monument. So the Capitol towers over, the rest of Washington, D.C. And that was intentional, right? As we said in last lecture, Congress was really the preeminent institution of our federal government in the eyes of most of our founders. So it's not surprising that the halls of Congress are in such a prominent location within our capital city. It should be mentioned that, that's a lot of people, right? So those 5 office buildings plus the Capitol itself, which is like 2 giant office buildings shoved together, that's an enormous amount of people who work at the Capitol and in and around Congress. Capitol is a small city within a city. There are about 20,000 or so people who work there on a daily basis, between members of Congress, between their staff, between committee staff, and just all of the other people who are working in that building every day, including, obviously any large building has to have, cleaners and mailroom people, and there are cafeterias in there. There are several gymnasiums, and all the people who maintain those, and so on and so forth. There's actually, the U.S. Capitol has its own police force, 200 officers. Would you guys cut it out? 200 officers dedicated solely to the Capitol, not the D.C. police, but just the Capitol Police. It's a city within a city to the extent that it even has its own subway system. I can see if I can show you that. So this is the United States Capitol subway system. It is a thing. It's got these cute little subway cars. There are subways that go from the Capitol to each of the office buildings. So including a monorail. So the point is that there's a whole lot of activity going on around here on any given day. Also on Capitol Hill, by the way, is also the Supreme Court and the Library of Congress. So an enormous amount of activity happens in and around the Capitol every single day. Congressional staffs make up a lot of that activity. Each member of Congress has a chief of staff who is kind of the person in charge of everything that member of Congress does. If you've ever watched a political drama and the candidate's there and they have like a sidekick, and the sidekick is like shuffling a bunch of papers and going, oh, well, you have a meeting at such and such with so-and-so, and they want this and they want that. That person is the chief of staff, right? They're the person who usually deals with the interface between legislator and their staff members. And so obviously that's an enormously powerful position, right? You're the person who controls access to that legislator. Members of Congress are going to have a legislative director, and that's somebody who is in charge of actually, legislating and doing the work of Congress. What bills are we working on? What are our positions on this and that and the other? Who are our allies? All that good stuff. I just got a frog in my throat this morning. Press secretaries. Press secretaries are the folks who go out in front of the cameras and do official press releases and things like that for politicians, for members of Congress. Schedulers obviously do what it says in the tin, right? Somebody has to be in charge of the work of scheduling a member of Congress, because it is an enormous time commitment, and it is a very constant and complex time commitment between the duties of legislating and committee work, the requirements of call time, like we talked about last lecture, all of those meetings back home with constituents, all of those plane flights from home to DC and back. All of that has to be worked out by somebody very carefully. So most members of Congress have a person to do that. And there's going to be other folks in that office. You know, there's got to be people to answer constituent communication. That's a lot of what these staffers do. So there's going to be somebody to answer the phones. If you call your member of Congress, you're not going to get your member of Congress. You'll get Susie, the intern, and she'll take down your position, and it'll get compiled and put into a report for the member eventually, right? Talk about constituent service here. Let me take a real quick look. No, yeah, I'm going to talk about constituent service here. So one of the things that those staff members do is help y'all, is do constituent service, which is, helping, folks from your district interact with the federal government. So if anyone is planning on going to Washington, D.C. when we're all finally allowed to leave our neighborhoods again, God, I'm looking forward to that day. If anyone's planning on going to Washington, D.C. anytime, contact your member of Congress. You'll see that if we go here, this is Dina Titus. She's my member of Congress, and if you live near CSN in Charleston, probably yours too. You can see that she actually has a button that says Visiting DC right here. Here, Constituent Services. My number one priority is to provide the best services possible to meet the needs of people living in the 1st District, which is central Las Vegas. My staff and I can assist you in your dealings with federal agencies, as well as help you find federal grants for your community project. Order a flag. They'll give you flags flown over the U.S. Capitol to memorialize fallen military officers. Secure various tours in our nation's capital, and apply for nominations to our service academies, which includes like West Point and the Naval Academy. From Las Vegas to Washington, D.C., we are here to serve you, blah, 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 blah. Point is, if you're going to go visit Washington, D.C., strongly recommend you go to your member of Congress's office, or go to their website, get in touch, because if you look here, you can apply for tours and tickets for all sorts of stuff in Washington, D.C. I didn't hear about the State Department diplomatic tour. So on and on and on and on and on. A lot of the stuff is free. If you go to DC, one of the cool things about visiting DC is it is all it's all public. It's all, it all belongs to you. So it's all government buildings. So it's all actually free. But the downside of that is there typically are exceedingly long lines for tickets. So when you go to Washington, D.C., you don't want to spend all the time in line, you can contact your member of Congress and they will hook you up with tours. So definitely do that. That is a form of constituent service, which is a lot of what congressional staffs work on. So if you are having trouble with getting grandma's Social Security check, maybe you can call your member of Congress. Call Dina Titus, call Susie Lee, call Horsford. And they will probably get things moving for you. If you want to go to the Naval Academy after leaving here at CSN, if you want to go to West Point, contact your member of Congress. They can make that happen for you. They can help make that happen. I'm not sure if they can make that happen for you. Point is, this is something that pretty much every office of Congress does, and they do it on a nonpartisan basis. It's not like if you're a Republican, you can't go tour the Capitol. So this is something that they do regardless. One of the few good things that our Congress does. So thought I'd make you aware of that. So how does Congress work? Well, like any institution, there are folks within it that can make things happen, and there are folks within it who let things happen, right? We're going to talk here about congressional leadership. So Lyndon Johnson, people may not know this in taking my class today. He was president for a while, but before that, he was a longtime majority leader of the U.S. Senate. And when he was talking about his time in the Senate, he basically said that, there are two types of senators. There are whales that can go wherever they want and just kind of move everything out of the way. And there's minnows who need to get behind the whales or get run over, right? I'm not sure if his analogy is quite appropriate for the way like fluid dynamics in water work or the way that actual fish work, but minnows and whales, right? Just go with me on this one. Um, but so, there are key members of each chamber who are able to actually really influence landmark legislation, and then there are those who really can't, right? A lot of the people who are whales in Congress are part of the formal leadership. Not all of them. John McCain, for example, was famously a very powerful senator for a very long time without being part of formal Republican Party leadership. So you can be a mover and a shaker without being in leadership, but it helps, right? So who are our party leaders? Well, the House of Representatives, I'm actually going to get back to these folks in just a bit. Because first, we need to talk about this lovely lady. So this is Nancy Pelosi. She is the current Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Speaker is the big difference between the Senate and the House. So in the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House, which is always elected from the majority party among the House, technically they don't have to be a member of the House, but this has never happened that they haven't been. Currently, it is Nancy Pelosi. She's a Democrat. She represents inner San Francisco. And she is one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C. The Speaker of the House is an extremely powerful position, as we're going to see in a bit. But in the House, as I mentioned in last lecture, if you have a majority in the House, you basically get to do whatever you want. It's not like the Senate where we have all these legislative holds and filibusters and all this good stuff. So, oops, I'm getting ahead of myself. House leadership is more majoritarian. House leadership is more likely to have very centralized control going through the office of the Speaker of the House. And it's also likely to be more partisan because, quite frankly, you don't ever need the minority party. If you have 50% plus one vote, you get what you want. Leadership in the Senate has to be much more patient, much more consensus-driven, because, remember, if you don't get that unanimous consent from all the senators, it can gum up the works for a very long time. So, leadership. The majority party votes for a Speaker of the House. The Speaker of the House has the right to preside over the chamber on special occasions, like the State of the Union, for example. Is the ultimate voice on procedural issues in the House. Has the authority to assign members to committees, which are as enormously powerful, as we're going to see in a bit. Also assigns legislation to committees, which are, again, enormously powerful, as we're going to see in a bit. The Speaker of the House does have the charge to maintain order and civility in the House, which, technically there is a House Sergeant at Arms, and as I said, 200 Capitol Police officers at their disposal to do so. The Speaker sets the agenda for the House. So we've talked about agenda setting and how powerful agenda setting is before in this class. If you can determine what it is that gets addressed, and more importantly, what doesn't get addressed, then you can make sure that anything that you want to happen at least has a chance of happening, and anything you don't want to happen isn't going to happen, right? So the Speaker's office controls the agenda in the House. They are the ones who do the scheduling for the bills. So if a bill is going to get considered, it has to get the nod from the Speaker of the House first. And that is extraordinarily powerful, because if you're the Speaker of the House and you don't want something to happen, it doesn't happen, right? The Speaker is also a major negotiator for the House and often for the Congress as a whole if there's a unified Congress, to negotiate in interbranch negotiations with their Senate counterparts and with the White House. So, for example, during the debate over Obamacare repeal, during the beginning of the Trump administration, Speaker of the House Paul Ryan, like I said, was up and down Pennsylvania Avenue, right? From Capitol Hill to the White House, trying to negotiate a compromise that would allow Obamacare repeal to go forward. Thank heavens that it didn't, because I still have health insurance, and I really appreciate that. So yeah, the Speaker serves as a negotiator with other branches of our government. So let's get back to those other white guys. Oh, excuse me, I apologize to Jim Clyburn. So we have, on both sides of the House, we have party leadership, majority and minority leader. We have Majority Leader Steny Hoyer and Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. They're the Democratic leadership. So in the majority leader is actually second in command, and the whip is third. The minority leader, Kevin McCarthy, is the first in command for the Republicans, and his minority whip, Steve Scalise, is second. We're going to talk about what those positions mean in just a second. So the majority leader is the floor manager, the negotiator, and the spokesperson for the party on the floor of the House. The majority leader is the one who spends a lot of time actually in the chamber or walking the hallways, keeping their eyes and ears out, negotiating, managing the passage of bills, and making sure that everything goes the way that the majority wants it to. Third in line is the majority whip, and the whip is what it sounds like. The whip is supposed to crack the whip and get the party in line. So they're responsible for party discipline, meaning that making sure that Democrats all vote the same way on bills that are important to the party. We actually have a relatively weak level of party discipline in the United States. There's not that much that the political parties can do to somebody who defies them in the United States. Whereas in places like the United Kingdom, you could actually be kicked out of your political party if you vote the wrong way on a bill. It's like, if you don't vote this way, well, then you're no longer a member of the Labor Party. Have fun with that. Members in some countries, especially in Latin America, you can actually be kicked out of the institution entirely. You can be kicked out of the legislature, gone, for voting the wrong way. The parties have that much power. In the United States, they do not. We have very candidate-centric elections, and we have very individualistic elections. And so party whips have to do a lot more persuading, cajoling, and massaging than they would in other political systems. On the minority side, we do see that they have the same leadership, except they don't have a speaker, right? There's a minority leader, there's a minority whip. And they do the same thing that their majority counterparts do as well. But also note that the majority leader is also sometimes asked to serve that kind of media spokesperson, interbranch negotiator role more often because there is no Speaker of the House to do that kind of stuff for the minority party. So we also have leadership in the Senate, right? And if you remember from the Constitution chapter, the vice president is actually given the authority to preside over the Senate. Technically, Mike Pence is the president of the Senate. However, that power is almost never used, because it turns out it's a terribly boring job, and there's not a whole lot of power behind it. So the vice president could show up and take the Senate gavel whenever he wants, but he never does. The only time you really see the vice president in the Senate chamber is when there's going to be a close vote, in which case he's needed for tie-breaking. As we're going to talk about, the position of the vice presidency is not an enormously powerful position. But one of the powers that it is given is the power to break ties in the United States Senate, because by its nature, why not what? Oh, why don't we ever see Mike Pence in the Senate chamber? Just because it's terribly dull. It is a dull and a stressful thing to do, to go up there and manage the processes in the Senate. And so if you don't have to do it, you can avoid it. So he rarely shows up, except when there is the case of a close vote where there's a possibility of a tie. If there's a tie, the vice president can break that tie in the favor of their party. So, as you can see, if your party has the White House, you only need 50 votes in the Senate for a majority. If your party doesn't have the White House, you need 51. There's also a Senate president pro tempore. Pro tempore just means because of time. And as of right now, it's Chuck Grassley. I thought it was Orrin Hatch, but I guess he left. So Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley is the longest serving senator in the majority party. And, where does it say? How long has Chuck Grassley been in the Senate? He was first elected in 1980. So this man has been in the United States Senate for 40 years. And because of that, that makes him the Senate President pro tempore, who is officially given the authority to act in the vice president's absence. So on very important, very formal occasions, the President pro tempore also often ends up presiding over the Senate. During normal times, though, the Senate is actually a pretty egalitarian institution. Every senator takes a turn, half an hour behind the dais, presiding over the Senate. And they just rotate. Everybody gets a turn. Because again, presiding over the Senate is not fun. It is grueling work without much power involved. Also on the Senate side, we do have party leaders of the United States Senate. These fine people. So we have the Demon Turtle, Mitch McConnell, who is the Majority Leader of the United States Senate. We have Majority Whip John Thune, who just looks like a used car salesman. But so do these two guys. Chuck Schumer, Democrat, Minority Leader. Dick Durbin, Minority Whip. So you'll notice that one of the differences between the House and the Senate is that there is no Speaker of the Senate. There is no extra office that the majority party gets to occupy. There are majority and minority leaders, majority and minority whips. The majority leader of the Senate does have a lot of power, but not as much as the Speaker of the House. So the majority leader does have the authority to control the Senate's agenda, but they don't have that power unilaterally. Because remember that senators can revoke their unanimous consent at any time and throw a wrench in the whole situation. So The the majority leader often collaborates with the minority leader in scheduling votes in the Senate, although we've seen less of that sort of behavior in these highly polarized times. And the whips in the Senate do exactly what they do in the House. Again, maintain party discipline, make sure that senators vote the right way. This can often be enormously important in the Senate because often votes in the Senate are decided by, 2 or 3 senators here or there. Most of the work in Congress is done by the committees. Do I have a list of my... No, I don't have a list of my committees. I'm going to have to find that on the internet real quick. So each house has a number of committees. In this case, we're just going to talk about the permanent committees. We'll get on to the other types in just a second, I promise. But so each house has a number of committees. These are the house's committees. So you can see agriculture, budget, education, energy, financial services, homeland security, natural resources, transportation, on and on and on and on and on. This is the United States Senate's list of committees. There are 24 of them. You can see they're broadly similar, although not exactly the same. You can see finance, commerce, science, and transportation are all kind of shoved together in the Senate. There's a budget, there's a banking, there's armed services, judiciary, there's an Indian Affairs Committee, on and on and on. So those are the standing committees of the United States Congress. What do they do? Well, committees are really the workhorses of Congress. You see, members of Congress, by and large, are not highly trained specialists in their particular policy area. I think I've mentioned this before. I mentioned in the elections chapter that the most common previous job for a member of Congress is attorney. So lots of these guys were lawyers, right? And so they're not necessarily experts on, complex derivative finance or nuclear industry regulations or, counterterrorism strategy, what have you. What committees do is committees allow members of Congress to specialize. Every member of Congress is assigned to a committee by either the Speaker's office in the House, the Majority or Minority Leader's office in the Senate. And those committees do a lot of the basic work of Congress. They draft legislation, they hold hearings, they do oversight. We'll talk about this in more detail in a bit. They have a role in drafting the budget. All of that stuff is played out in the committees. And so members of Congress are actually allowed to specialize over time in a particular policy area, right? You get on a committee, you sit there for 10, 20, 30, in frickin' Chuck Grassley's case, 40 years, and you learn a thing or two, right? If you sit on the Finance Committee in the U.S. Senate for a couple decades, you are going to know something about finance by the time you leave. So yeah, it is committees that actually do most of the drafting of legislation. Committees will also sponsor hearings. You've seen these probably on the TV machine, at least snippets of these, where members of Congress will call hearings to look into various issues, right? And they'll call witnesses, and they'll ask them to testify, and all that good stuff. That's a way that congressional committees can gather information that they need to do their legislative work. Committees do have the power of executive branch oversight, partially through that hearings process, because a lot of people don't know this, but congressional committees have subpoena power, meaning that if you are called in front of a congressional committee to testify, you have to go. It's like court. If you don't go, they can actually throw you in jail for it. Although it hasn't been done in a really long time, it is theoretically a thing that they have the constitutional power to do. And they definitely have fined people. They haven't jailed anybody, but they have fined people for not showing up to testify for Congress. And so committees also, as I said, have authority over drafting the federal budget. So when the budget starts coming out of Congress, the committees are going to have the authority to draft the budget for the agencies that fall under their jurisdiction. So the budget for the Department of Transportation, that's going to fall under the Transportation Committee. So if you're official at the Department of Transportation and you get a member of the House who's on that committee showing up at your place of work, well, you kiss their ass like you wouldn't believe, because they're the ones who actually control whether or not you're going to have a job next year, right? So committees have an important role to play in executive branch oversight, which is why you've seen, by the way, the war that's been going on between the Trump White House and the Democratic House, where Democratic congressional committees have been subpoenaing documents, for example, including Trump's tax returns, and the administration has been just like, yeah, screw you guys. And there are a number of cases tied up in court right now of Trump administration officials who are trying to figure out whether or they should listen to the Trump administration and not testify, or they should listen to the very official-looking subpoena that they got from Congress and go testify. So that's a constitutional crisis, just letting y'all know. So I was talking about standing committees. Standing committees are the permanent committees that stick around from Congress to Congress. They're permanent bodies with fixed jurisdictions. So the House Committee on Agriculture, right? It's been there for a really long time. It's not going anywhere, and it does one thing, right? Should be noted that permanent standing committees have different levels of prestige assigned to them. Traditionally, the oldest ones are the most influential, though some new ones, like intelligence, can be enormously influential as well. So looking here let's look at the House list, because the Senate mushes a bunch of things together. They have fewer senators, so that's why. So, there are certain committees that just anybody wants to be on, and there are certain committees that, nobody wants to be on, right? So, Foreign Affairs, for example, a very powerful committee, right? Ways and Means, Appropriations, and Budget are all very powerful. Anything that deals with the money is very important. It also might depend on, though, where you're from, what committee you might want to get on, right? So if I'm a legislator from Nevada, we have a whole lot of public lands and resource extraction work that goes on here in our state. So maybe I'd want to be on the Natural Resources Committee. If I'm a senator from California, where something like 95% of the nation's fresh fruits and vegetables are grown, I might want to be on the Agriculture Committee, right? Some members of Congress have their own interests, right? So, if I personally ever get into Congress, I'm probably going to want to be on the Education Committee just because I've had experience in education, right? Then there are committees like House Administration or the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. Nobody cares about that stuff, right? There's also the Rules Committee that sounds really boring, but we're going to talk about why it's not in a bit. So, but the point is that different kind of standing committees vary widely in their prestige. We also have select or special committees. These are committees that are created to investigate a particular issue for a defined period of time. So there have been select committees on, there's a select committee on 9/11. There was a select committee on steroid use in baseball. There was most recently a select committee to investigate Benghazi, which was a giant media circus. But so you get the point. They exist to address one particular issue. They pop up, they deal with it, they go away. They're temporary. So select committees are special committees. There are joint committees. Joint committees are committees that are made up of people from both the House and the Senate. So sorry, it's not as fun as it sounds. But joint committees address topics of continuing importance to both houses. So we can take a look. There's a joint select committee on solvency of multi-employer pension plans. So that's, both joint and select, meaning that it's made up of members of the House and the Senate. And it's a select committee, so it's temporary, it's going to go away. So we have a joint committee on taxation. We have a joint economic committee. We have a joint committee on the library, which I'm sure nobody wants to be on, or the joint committee on printing, right? Just because they're not terribly powerful. Finally, the last type of committee that we're going to talk about is conference committees. Conference committees are set up, they are technically a type of joint select committee because they are made up of members of both houses and they are temporary to resolve a specific issue. In this particular case, conference committees are set up to resolve differences between versions of the same legislation passed out of the House and out of the Senate. We'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit. So the point of committees, though, is that they enable Congress to be fairly sophisticated, even though most members of Congress don't spend a lot of time investigating really technical aspects of their job. Congress is able to specialize in particular issues and devise, clever legislative strategies for a bunch of different issues. And instead of having the whole Congress trying to take on every issue, committees are able to winnow down the list so that only the important stuff really makes its way to the full House. So committees are enormously important sites of work in our legislature. How do you get on a committee? Well, in the House, you get assigned to the committee by the Speaker. In the Senate, that decision rests in the majority leader's hands, although there's an extra N there for some reason. The minority party gets to recommend committee assignments, and they're typically followed, but they don't have to be. So here's the thing about committee assignments. Obviously, there are committees that are more prized than others, right? I said that you want to be on appropriations, you don't so much want to be on the Joint Committee on Printing. But committee assignments are typically doled out, committee assignments are doled out by the House based on who is in with them and who isn't, right? And oftentimes, the longer you are in Congress, the more likely you are able to choose your committee assignment, and so obviously you got to kind of pay your dues, right? Committee assignments are officially subject to a vote, although the Speaker's office is really influential. The Speaker also assigns chairs of the committee. Now, typically, the chairman or chairwoman of the committee is the majority party member with the longest service on that committee, right? So whoever has been on the committee the longest from the majority party is typically the committee chair. We refer to the minority party member who's been on the committee longest as the ranking member, and they also often have some amount of power. I say often, but not always. Seniority is often, but not always, how we determine our committee chairmanship. So if you see a situation where there is a member of Congress who's been on a committee longer than somebody else, but they're not the chairperson, that member of Congress pissed off House leadership or pissed off Senate leadership, right? One of the few tools that our parties do have in terms of party discipline. They can't kick you out of office. They can't really kick you out of the party. But they can take away your committee chairs. They can even take away your committee assignments. They can bust you back down to naming post offices. Have fun with that, right? So committee assignments are important, and they're also one of the few bargaining chips that party leadership has in this whole process. Any questions? Seeing nothing, we're going to move on to legislative policy making. How does a bill become law in our system? Well, 5 words. Complex process, difficult to win. Remember that our founders set up our institutions such that there are many, many points where a bill can fail, and only a few where it can succeed, right? We saw how nervous Bill was in the Schoolhouse Rock video about being left on the Capitol steps. Most bills fail. Let's see. I had all this pulled up last week, or on Monday, but we didn't get that far, so here are some statistics, some tables on bill passage rates in different historical Congresses. And so this is the last 20 years it's on the screen here, right? So this is the number of bills that were introduced into Congress. So as of right now, there have been 11,859 bills introduced into the present Congress, which has run since January 3rd of 2019. So 11,000 bills. Of those, 542 of them got a vote, and 138 of them were actually enacted as law. Well, most of the time, the difference between got a vote and is enacted is getting a vote in both chambers. Right, so of 11,800 bills, 138 have been enacted. Now, it should be noted that a lot of bills do happen in the latter half of the last year of a congressional session. Congress kind of, sees the clock ticking and gets their act in gear. But still, just 1% of bills introduced in this Congress have been enacted. Look in the last Congress, $13,556. And of that, or excuse me, not dollars, bills. 13,556 bills were introduced. 443 were enacted. Right, so this is a difficult process to navigate. So how does a bill become law? Well, like the video says, bills start out as ideas. Somebody has to come up with an idea for a law, and often we'll start drafting, some sort of rough legislative language before proposing it to a member of Congress. Only elected members of the House and the Senate have the right to introduce a bill. So oftentimes you'll see, in particular, on the news, they'll talk about, President Obama's healthcare plan or Trump's tax bill, right? But presidents don't actually have the authority to introduce a bill to Congress. Only members of the House and Senate can. So you can actually go into Thomas, which is the Library of Congress's bill tracking system, and you can search for bills that were introduced on request, and that means that the president asked for them to be introduced. They still have to be introduced by an official elected member of Congress in order to be actually considered fully introduced. That member who does the introduction is considered the primary sponsor. First page, one bill sponsor is absolutely necessary. You can have any number of co-sponsors. The whole chamber could co-sponsor a bill if they wanted, but you have to have at least one primary sponsor. Co-sponsorship is an indication that people support your bill. So if you have more co-sponsors, it's more likely to get through. So, should mention that members of Congress don't have to do the drafting process on their own. In fact, even members' staff doesn't have to do the drafting process on their own. We do have an organization called the Congressional Research Service, which spends a lot of time getting information for Congress and helping them with the task of drafting legislation. Should we mention that the Congressional Research Service is actually a taxpayer-funded agency, and so they do make a lot of their reports and things available to the public. So if you want, you can go to crsreports.congress.gov and find all sorts of reports that have been prepared by the Congressional Research Service for members of Congress. So if you wanted to know how COVID-19 is going to affect public water, here is a report from the Congressional Research Service about how COVID-19 is going to affect water. It looks like most of the way that COVID-19 is going to affect water is making it so that people can't pay for it. So, good to know. There's a report on infertility in the military. There's a report on U.S. policy towards Cuba. So anything you can imagine. A primer on Medicare, on and on and on and on and on. So the Congressional Research Service gathers that information so that members of Congress can have the information they need to make the decisions that they need to make. My allergies are acting up. Something fierce today. I promise you it's not coronavirus. So you can see usually around 10 to 15,000 bills are introduced in any given Congress. And that bill is going to get submitted in one of two different ways. In the Senate, they have pages. So a senator will just raise their hand and a page will come over and fetch the bill and bring it up front and put it in the inbox. In the House, they're a little more, common folk in the House, and so they have to hand deliver their own legislation to the clerk or to a drop-in tray. So basically, in both cases, we're talking about a very formal process of putting something in an inbox. But so the clerk will assign the bill a number, so that they're going to start with HB 1, House Bill 1, and SB 1, Senate Bill 1, and they move on through there. So the 10,000th piece of legislation introduced is, House Bill 10,000 and House Bill 10,000, right? So in each case, the representative will, or the senator, the elected official, will note a suggestion for committee referral, and the clerk will put that down. That's influential but not determinative. Committee referrals are, as we said, done by the Speaker's office or the majority leader's office in the Senate. For the overwhelming majority of bills, that's it. For something like 87% of legislation, it gets put in the tray, it gets printed overnight, it gets assigned to a committee, and then it sits gathering dust in a filing cabinet in every congressional office until the session expires and it's no longer a viable bill. So yeah, bills that don't get passed by the adjournment of Congress, or by the time of, excuse me. So we start new congressional sessions in the first week of January. If a bill doesn't get passed by the time the new session starts, it dies. And that is the fate of the overwhelming majority of legislation. Only about 13% of bills even see any sort of action in a committee. By the way, I did make a flowchart for y'all for legislative policy making, and I'm going to have this chart up on Canvas. I don't know why I didn't already put it up there, but I will go ahead and put that up today. If you look in here, you'll see that this is a typical bill. It's introduced in the House. The House is in blue because they're controlled by the Democrats. The Senate is in red because it's controlled by the Republicans. Conference committee is purple because it's a little bit of red, a little bit of blue. And the White House is in orange because, well, he's orange. But so this is congressional policy making as a flowchart. The important thing to remember about this chart is that pretty much every single one of these boxes is a veto point. So what you're not seeing, what I didn't indicate there because it would have made the chart very, very messy, is that every single one of these points, the bill could die. So it could be introduced and then nothing happens. Be introduced and then see committee action and then they vote it down. It could be introduced and reported out of committee, but the speaker doesn't schedule it, right? And you get the point. So every single one of these points is a veto point. Look at all the people that you have to satisfy to get an act of Congress passed. This is what I mean when I say that our system of government is designed to be unwieldy, complex, and difficult to use, right? Our system of government is designed so that any of a dozen people can kill a piece of legislation if they so desire. So what's the next box on this list? So we start with an idea, somebody drafts a bill, they introduce it to the legislature, and let's assume that it doesn't die and a committee actually takes it up. Well, what do committees do? Well, committees hold hearings on policy topics, right? They're going to get together. If they're considering a bill, they're going to be like, oh, well, okay, here's a bill on, I don't know, school buses and stop at railroad crossings. That's the one from Schoolhouse Rock, right? They're going to have hearings and invite like school administrators and transportation officials and probably railroad people and talk about the relative merits of the proposal, right? They're going to hold hearings about that. If they're going to pass a bill about healthcare, they're going to hold hearings about, they're going to invite healthcare people and health insurers and doctors and representatives of interest groups like the AMA and pharma and all that. They're all going to come and give testimony to Congress and tell them what they think they should do, what would be best for their sector of society on a particular policy issue. Committees also prepare legislation for floor consideration. So they'll take the bills that are introduced and they'll mark them up. They'll change them. They'll edit them. They'll rejigger things, and they'll make compromises and things like that. So committees will sit around and prepare legislation for floor consideration, including what they call a markup session. A markup session is where Just like it sounds. Everybody on the committee sits around with a copy of the bill and a red pen, and they mark it up. And when they're done, hopefully it's something that everybody can live with. But committees do kill legislation, right? Committees absolutely will let a whole lot of bills just rot in their filing cabinets. Remember, of the 10 to 15,000 bills that get introduced in any given Congress, only about 12 to 1,500 of them even see any sort of committee action. Committees also do exercise oversight. Committees, I mentioned, have a role to play in the budget process, and so can hold hearings on not only what laws they're thinking about proposing, but can hold hearings on laws that they previously proposed and see, hey, is this working out really well? Is this a law that we should keep? Is it something that we should repeal? Is it something we need to tweak? That sort of thing. And they can exercise oversight over federal agencies that are carrying out their legislation. So let's assume that we've gotten from the committee that the bill has been reported out of the committee. You'd think the next step is the floor, but no. You see, getting to the floor is a complex process. The Senate, the bill has to be placed on the calendar. The majority leader does that, so the office of the majority leader has that responsibility in the Senate. See, right here, majority leader. But remember that in the Senate, the lack of unanimous consent for any bill can significantly delay Senate proceedings. So the majority leader must work in concert with the minority leader and with individual other members of the Senate to make sure that they're not going to put a hold on a piece of legislation. Really need to mute that. So in the House, that decision falls to the Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House is the one who decides when a vote is going to happen. So if the Speaker of the House does not want a piece of legislation happening, it doesn't happen, right? Bills can get stuck on calendar in both chambers. In the House, there's also the additional complication of the Rules Committee. I mentioned the Rules Committee sounds boring, but it's actually really, really powerful. So the Rules Committee has to write a process, or write a rule for each bill. And that rule sets out the process by which that bill is going to be debated. How much time is each side going to have for their arguments? Are there going to be amendments accepted? What sort of amendments? How many? All that how long are people going to be allowed to speak on the amendments? All that sort of detail is set by the Rules Committee. So the Speaker's office can just not schedule a bill. The Rules Committee, they have to issue a bill, or they have to issue a rule for a bill, but they don't have to issue a good one, right? So obviously, if you can control the terms of the debate, if you can control the terms of amendments, all that stuff, well, then you can control the final shape of that legislation to a relatively high degree. So the Rules Committee, while it probably can't kill laws outright, it can definitely leave them in a place to die easy, as Nathan Fillion once said on Firefly. So bills can absolutely get stuck on calendar in both chambers because, let's take a look at those statistics again. Oh, shoot. So, not looking at the most current Congress, let's look at the last one. Notice that of 13,556 bills that were introduced, 14 got a vote and failed. 14. It's less than 1%. Right? So that's kind of amazing, right? That should tell you something about what is necessary for a bill to get on calendar. What's necessary for a bill to get on calendar is for leadership to think they can win, right? So typically what happens is that unless they have the votes, they don't vote. And you saw this during the Obamacare repeal debate at the beginning of the Trump administration. Because you saw, Senate expected to vote on Obamacare repeal Monday. No, wait, Wednesday. No, wait, Thursday. No, wait, next Tuesday. No, wait, next Thursday. Over and over and over again. Because quite simply the Senate didn't have the votes. And that we saw that, right? It wasn't until the White House finally got so frustrated with the Senate process and said, just vote on the damn bill, and that Senate leaders the Republican Senate leaders were afraid to defy the White House on that, so they actually finally scheduled the vote. But ordinarily, that vote would have never been taken. They wouldn't have voted on that because they didn't have the votes. Normally, senators don't, or Senate majority leaders don't bring things to the floor unless they're pretty sure they can pass. So it's very, very, very rare for a major party to take a signature piece of legislation all the way up to the Senate floor and then fail, and then have that vote fail. Why? Because it's embarrassing. It looks like you can't get your shit together, right? You guys have a majority and you can't even pass your own signature piece of legislation when it's only 50 votes? Well, you look pretty damn incompetent, right? And that's why congressional leaders don't vote unless they win, right? Anyway, so if the bill gets to the floor, whoops. The bill will be assigned a floor manager, which is often the majority leader, which is somebody who handles amendments and keeps the time and makes sure that nobody goes over their time for debate. In the House, the House manager can extend time for debate, can allow multiple votes, can do whatever they need to do to make sure the process moves forward. In the Senate, obviously, things are a little less controlled because any senator may halt all activity by refusing to yield the full floor or withdrawing their unanimous consent on a bill. So things can die on the floor without ever even coming to a vote. Right? Something can make it to the floor, get debated, and then they just decide to table it and it just goes away. Indeed, that's how things often die on the floor. Because remember, it's very rare to see bills scheduled where they're going to be voted down. When the actual vote happens, they have two ways of doing it. They have voice votes and roll call votes. Voice votes are votes where, just like it sounds, the presiding officer asks people to vote with their voice. All those in favor say aye, aye. All those opposed say nay, nay. And whichever sounds louder, that is what we go with. No record is kept besides, we do actually have video of all that, C-SPAN does, but they don't keep an individual tally of who voted for what. And indeed it has been, typically voice votes are only used in non-controversial issues where pretty much everybody agrees, right? You don't want to be trying to figure out who's louder when it's 51% one way, 49% the other. So typically voice votes only happen on non-controversial subjects. But sometimes they happen on controversial subjects. Sometimes they happen on controversial subjects and the presiding officer seems to ignore the actual voices of the people in the chamber. This happens more often at state legislatures than in the U.S. Congress, but it does happen in Congress, where the presiding officer will hold a voice vote, and the ayes sound louder, but the presiding officer says the nays have it, or vice versa. So sometimes asking for a voice vote can be a shady tactic, but most of the time it's pretty routine for non-controversial bills. Roll call votes, on the other hand, are votes on major legislation, controversial stuff, votes where every single member's vote is recorded. In the Senate, they do that by roll call, and it's not nearly as formal as you think. I've actually watched the Senate voting. Like, I was in the chamber, and they happened to be voting on a bill because we were visiting D.C. that day. And my mom got in trouble because she was like, "Look, honey, there's there's Ted Kennedy, and there's Hillary Clinton, and the security guy had to be like, "Ma'am, there's no pointing in the Senate gallery. It looks too much like a rifle." But so anyway, the senators, they kind of wander in and out. They don't all sit in those desks all day. They're mostly just kind of standing around talking with each other in clumps, and they'll just kind of walk in and be like, "Clinton votes aye," and then just kind of go back to talking. It's very informal. But so in the Senate, they do vote by voice. They actually shout their name and their vote. In the House, they have smart cards that go into their desks that record their votes. They actually have to like cha-chung, cha-chung, and record their vote electronically. Votes on major bills are the most important public act that a member of Congress performs. And so we can look back at people's voting records and see how they voted, right? In fact, many interest groups will put out what they call a legislative scorecard. And you've maybe not heard of this idea by name, but you've heard of the idea. Because you've heard politicians boasting about how they got an A rank from the NRA, right? Well, that's because the NRA puts out a report card for politicians. They look at roll call votes. This is how they do that. They look and say, okay, well, which votes were relevant to gun safety? Which do we care about? Or to gun rights, not gun safety. They don't do that at the NRA. And actually, I should say that I do know that the NRA has a significant program of like instructors and things like that, but that was kind of a cheap shot. Anyway, so they look through all the bills, see what was what was in their interest in a given session, and they look at how each member voted. And if you voted with us 90% of the time or more, you get an A. 80% you get a B, and so on and so forth, right? So roll call votes are the most important public act a member of Congress performs because they are, visible. We can look back in time and see exactly how every single member of Congress voted on every single issue. I showed you, by the way, I showed you I showed you this stuff. These are what we political scientists call DW nominate scores, and they're generated based on roll call votes, right? So we can look back. The reason we do that is because we can look back, to 1780 or 1790 and look at the official roll call votes of members of Congress, and we can compare their ideologies based on that. So that's how we're able to generate charts like this. I already talked about the filibuster. Filibuster is going nuts. But let's move on in our flowchart. Let's assume the bill passed the Rules Committee, passed the House floor, moved over to the Senate, where, by the way, yes, it all starts over again. A bill that passes out of the House gets assigned a committee in the Senate and could very well die, in fact, often dies, in a filing cabinet over in the Senate. There are hundreds of bills that the Democratic House has passed that the Senate isn't taking up at all because they're Republicans and they don't want those bills to pass, right? But let's assume this bill passes committee action in the Senate. The majority leader schedules it. It passes the Senate floor. Okay, awesome. But here's the thing with legislation. The Constitution requires that an identical piece of legislation pass the House and the Senate in order to become law. Even 1 comma difference in a 500-page bill is a difference and means that you have to go back and do it again. So you have to pass the same bill exactly out of the House and the Senate. Typically, the way that we do that is through the use of a conference committee. A conference committee is technically a joint select committee. It is a committee made up of members of both houses, and it exists for a temporary period of time to reconcile the differences between a specific piece of legislation. The conference committee cannot alter pieces of legislation that were agreed upon, but they can do whatever else they want with the sections that were not agreed upon. And when the conference committee's work is done, fortunately, we don't have to start all over. You'll see that from the conference committee, we go directly to an up or down floor vote. No amendments, no discussion, just yes or no vote. That is a privileged thing that conference committee resolutions get to do. It should be noted that you don't need to use a conference committee. So a prominent example of this was the passage of Obamacare. So Obamacare passed the House, so Obamacare passed the House. They started working on it in the Senate, but the Senate version ended up looking very, very different than the House's version, mostly because of the need to appease so-called blue dog Democrats, conservative Democrats from rural Midwestern and prairie states who really weren't too keen on the whole idea of government health insurance in the first place, so that's why they killed the public option, for example. The House bill had a public option, the Senate bill didn't. But they passed a version out of the Senate, which was a step in the right direction for American healthcare, and then Ted Kennedy died. And what was a 60-vote Democratic majority in the Senate became a 59-vote Democratic majority in the Senate, and that should sound important to you because of this. 60 votes is what you need to end a filibuster. So the Democrats could no longer pass this legislation in the Senate because the Republicans were 120% united against Obamacare, because this was socialist government health care that was going to kill grandma. I mean, it seems crazy to think about it now, but yeah, Obamacare was like derided in very much the same terms that Medicare for All is derided today, right? So Ted Kennedy died. Massachusetts held a special election for the new senator, and a Republican, Scott Brown, won. A dude who bought a pickup truck for his campaign and then sold it after, but whatever. Scott Brown won. Suddenly there's 59 Democrats in the Senate. They cannot pass Obamacare. So what ends up happening is the House ends up passing the exact same bill as the Senate passed because they still have a healthy Democratic majority in the House. And now, hey, you just had both houses pass the exact same legislation. They send it to the president, sign it into law. Right? So you don't necessarily need a conference committee, but it is typically the way these things work. You pass a piece of legislation out of both houses of Congress, it goes to the president's desk. There are 4 things that can happen at the president's desk. First off, the president may sign that law, and in that case, the law becomes, or may sign that bill. In that case, the bill becomes law. Second, the president can veto that bill. They can return the bill to Congress with a message saying why they believe it is unacceptable. So they can't just veto it for no reason. They do have to give a reason. There's no specifics on what that reason has to be, but they have to have a reason. And so the president can send that back to Congress, in which case Congress does have the ability to override that veto with a 2/3 vote in both houses, but obviously a 2/3 vote in both houses is difficult to manage. Um, Two other things can happen, though. One, the president can just sit on that bill for 10 days, and after 10 days, something will happen to it, depending on whether or not Congress is in session. If Congress is in session, the bill automatically becomes law. If Congress is out of session, it is what is known as a pocket veto, so it automatically does not become law. I should mention that because of Republicans basically trying to obstruct Obama from appointing his cabinet back in 2000 and 2008, Congress basically never goes out of session anymore. Because one of the powers the president has is to appoint people to vacancies for temporary appointments when Congress is out of session. So what happens is that, one member of the House will walk up to the dais and go, "I'm hereby calling the House of Representatives of the United States to order. I notice the lack of a quorum. I hereby adjourn the House of Representatives of the United States." It's what's called a pro forma session, but it still counts. So if the president were to sit on a law today, most likely it would become law without his signature. If, however, Congress were officially adjourned for some reason, that law would not, or that bill would not become law. It would be vetoed. We call that a pocket veto. So here's your book's flowchart. I think mine is better. So, because it does include a couple, like the rules committee that your book doesn't. But feel free to use either. But yeah, that's how a bill becomes law. Let's see. Let's finish with why is Congress unpopular? And this will be the end of my Congress lecture. So why is Congress so unpopular? How unpopular is Congress, you asked me? Well, congressional approval ratings have been measured as low as 9%. Here is a list of things that are more popular than Congress as of 2018. Big business in America, 21%. Nixon during Watergate, 24%. Government helping people escape poverty in America has only 26% approval. God, I hate this country sometimes. Our criminal justice system, 27%. Our banks, 32%. Amazingly enough, the IRS, 58%. Congress, 19%. And again, we've seen it as low as 9%. Comparison on that, 11% of the country approves of the U.S. going communist. So, at one point, that was actually more popular than Congress. But we re-elect 90% of our representatives year after year. So we talked about this a bit in Chapter 10. But most people support their own representative even as they hate the institution of Congress. Individual representatives have become very good at representing themselves as apart from the institution in which they serve. They're not part of the corruption. They're going to go and fight for you and solve the corruption. Of course, when every representative is saying the same thing, it begs the question, well, who is the corrupt one then? But constituents tend to like their own representatives. They don't like partisan fighting and gridlock. They don't like the fact that our Congress has been able to do less and less and less of substance in the past, 10, 15, 20 years. So we have partisan polarization in Congress. And the parties have become more sorted by ideology, and so they have become more partisan. But as we've talked about before, the main people pressing this fight are Republicans. You can see the death of the moderate Republican right here. You can also see the death of the moderate Democrat, right? But Democrats haven't moved that much. Republicans have moved a lot. So we see polarization on both sides, but it's mainly a right-wing phenomenon. So we have party polarization that makes it very, very difficult for any sort of legislation to pass, especially in cases of divided government, which is what we have right now, where each major party holds at least one of the three nationally elected institutions. So if we have at least one party led, one House of Congress led by a party who's opposed to the president, as you can see, it often leads to a slow policymaking process and number of legislative standoffs, right? And that's just getting worse, and that's only going to get worse as the Republican Party becomes more and more entrenched and more digging their heels in on ideological purity and their radical vision of a significantly diminished American government. Now, it used to be that so some political scientists argue that divided government is actually no less productive than unified government, and that actually used to be the case. If anyone was alive long enough to remember the 1994 contract with America and the amount of productivity that came out of divided government with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate and White House, there was actually a whole lot of major legislation that went on. Partially that's because Bill Clinton was the best Republicans the Democrats ever elected, well, until Joe Biden. They kind of agreed on a lot of stuff, but divided government used to be very productive. Not so anymore. In this era of partisan polarization, we have seen, especially a Republican Party, but both parties, willing to go to great lengths to deny their opposition any sort of political victory. Though again, more on the right than on the left. The Republican Party literally stole a Supreme Court seat rather than let a Democratic president appoint that Supreme Court seat. They broke norms on filibustering appointments. They did it to the Democrats and then said the Democrats couldn't do it to them. It has been a massive power grab in the Republican-dominated Senate for the last several years. And Mitch McConnell, if there is any justice, will go down as the man who destroyed American democracy. But enough on that. So, popular reforms. I'm going to add one in here. So first off, limit lobbying. Well, it's hard to do in America. Lobbying is protected under the First Amendment. You are given the right to petition your government for a redress of grievances. But we could at least do things, crack down harder on things like the gift ban and have more stringent requirements for registering as a lobbyist. And that would probably actually, do some good. But remember that lobbyists aren't necessarily bad people. Institutions that you care about have lobbyists. One person's beneficial civic organization is another person's nefarious special interest. So limiting lobbyists is just going to limit the participation of a lot of people in our society. So maybe the answer is what we're doing right now. Public education. Talking about why it is that these institutions act the way they do and behave the way they do. Maybe give members of the public more empathy for the difficult job, and it is a difficult job, that members of Congress do every day. Finally, the third popular reform that I want to talk about, because somebody tells me about it every time I get in an Uber, is term limits. So everybody think term limits is a good idea. Term limits is not a good idea. So many U.S. states have enacted term limits over the years, including our own fair silver state, where we do have 12-year term limits for all public offices except judgeships. And we have, as political scientists, studied what this has done to those places' legislatures and politics. And what it has done, overwhelmingly, is increase the power of lobbyists and big corporations. Because you see, legislating is a skill. People get in there, they learn their job, and they start to do it, and they gain experience. It takes time to learn, how to make things happen in a particular institution, which wheels need to be greased, where your bread is buttered, all that kind of stuff. It takes time to learn. And with term limits, people don't have time to learn because they're constantly looking for whatever their next office is. Trying to stay ahead of being kicked out of politics entirely. And so your legislators are all people who've been there, 6, 8, 10 years. You don't have any of that institutional memory that makes legislators go. So who does? Who's been around for the last 30, 40 years? The lobbyists, right? I doubt that the people lobbying for MGM change all that often. If the members of the legislature change out often and the lobbyists don't, who's going to get the power? And so term limits are actually a terrible idea for democracy. You actually want professional legislators writing your bills. It turns out it's a difficult and specialized job, and you want people to specialize in it. You want them to get better at it. So that's why term limits are a terrible, terrible idea. Anyway, that concludes my lecture on Congress. I am going to go ahead and sign off. I hope everyone out there is staying... Or, excuse me. Does anyone have any questions? But I hope everybody out there is staying safe and sane. Yeah, I can get in touch with you, Kimberly. No worries. I hope everyone out there is staying safe and sane. Papers coming up in the first week of May. And I'm trying to think if I have anything else for y'all right now. I don't think I do. So I'm going to say bye-bye and get in touch with you fine folks again on Monday morning at 10 a.m. See y'all.